Let's begin. Today I'm going to talk about my thesis, reconciling diachronic and synchronic analyses of lenition and eclipsis in Irish Gaelic, an optimality theoretic approach. Irish Gaelic has a system of initial phonological mutations that surface in particular morphosyntactic environments and are contrastive in the language. These mutations are a result of historical phonological assimilations whose phonological environments are no longer present in the modern language. For my thesis, I focused on two types of initial mutations, specifically those that target initial consonants, namely lenition and eclipsis. In modern Irish, lenition can be explained phonologically as a change in continuancy from minus continuant feature to a plus continuant feature. That is, a stop consonant becomes a fricative when in the correct morphosyntactic environment. Although this slide may be hard to see, here I have outlined the phonemes, the consonantal phonemes of Irish Gaelic and the lenited forms, and an example for each. I won't go through all of them, but one should note that the majority of the time, there is only a change in continuancy. For example, if you look at the first example, B, B is a bilabial stop, which is voiced, and then the lenited form is the bilabial fricative, also voiced. So there's only a change in continuancy. In modern Irish, eclipsis can be summed up in two different ways. One, a voiceless consonant will become voiced when in the correct environment, or two, a voiced non-nasal consonant will become a nasal consonant at the same place of articulation in the right environment. Here again is the consonantal chart and their eclipsed forms. As you can see, every single change is either from voiced to a nasal or voiceless to voiced. Historically, these mutations were a result of phonological assimilations. Namely, lenition was applied to consonants when the stop consonant was in a intervocalic environment. That is, while in between the two continuant vowels, the stop consonant gained the continuancy feature and became a fricative. Eclipsis occurred after nasal consonants, namely N and M in Irish, since those are the only nasal phonemes. And the same changes applied as mentioned on the previous slides. These mutations were a result of environments that usually had to do with the presence of particular particles in the morphosyntax or inflectional morphology. These particles and inflections usually ended in either a vowel or a nasal, and the result would trigger a mutational change on the first consonant of the following word. For example, I have taken from Summers 2008 a reconstruction of a primitive Irish sentence that is in the genitive case, a phrase, not a sentence. The genitive marker, which is in this case the I, pronounced E or I, occurs at the end of each word in the phrase. As one can see, the last three words in the phrase all are after the I and before another vowel, thus making every single one of those consonants in intervocalic position. For reference, these sounds for the R would be the trill, the M would have been a nasalized bilabial fricative, and the C would represent a velar fricative. Furthermore, for eclipsis, these environments would have been after a nasal. So I took the example from Stifer 2010, which is a part of the Blackwell published book on the Celtic languages. And I took the example of the complementizer k, which had a historical form kun. If you take the phrase tagantu, you come, and you put it in a relative clause, after the complementizer kun, you get kun jagantu, which means that you come. As you can see, the presence of the nasal changes the T in tagantu to the D in jagantu. There have been a variety of previous approaches in trying to analyze these mutations. Namely, they fall into three different types. Historical analyses, which contend that these are phonological processes that have been fossilized in the language and are only present today in the historical environments in which they occurred phonologically. This is not entirely true. There has been some evidence that nonce words in Irish will also undergo mutation when placed into sentences. Um, and it is not entirely fitting with the data that these mutations are strictly historical because certain morphosyntactic constructions, namely the dative, have changed from lenition to eclipsis over the centuries. If they were fossilized, we would expect not to see this change. A second approach is the lexical approach, which, much like prepositions in ancient Greek, that would be stored in the lexicon with particular specifications for the following case, namely genitive, accusative, or dative. Every word in Irish would be stored in the lexicon with a specification for either lenition, eclipsis, or no mutation. This does not entirely fit the data either because noun phrases can exhibit all three categories, no mutation, lenition, and eclipsis. Therefore, if a noun is stored in the lexicon as only a word plus a mutational specification, you would not expect to see the three different mutations occur. Finally, there are syntactic approaches that specifically target particular functional heads. That is, in the syntax, there are overt, lexicalized, after spell out in distributive morphology, uh, heads that are namely the complementizers, the tenses, and determiners, and these trigger a mutation. This also does not fit the data. For example, the past tense requires a lenition on the verb. However, there is no lexicalized tense head in modern Irish. Thus, if a lexicalized tense head triggers lenition and there is no lexicalized tense, you would not expect to see lenition, yet there is. My proposal is one that works off of research done in tonal morphemes, stress shifts, intonation, and featural affixation, and namely the work done on grammatical tone posed by Rose 1997, Roberts 1994, Deal Wolf in 2007, and many, many others. It is my contention that Old Irish did not entirely lose the morphological distinction when final syllables were lost. Rather, these morphemes remained in the language along with particular phonological features, but they lost their phonological segments. Therefore, mutation is actually a realization of these unsegmented features in order to provide the maximum amount of morphological contrast. My goal is to bridge the gap among these different analyses as well as incorporate the historical facts of these mutations and provide an analysis that captures the greatest possible body of data. For my proposal, I have proposed a set of morphemes that contain certain features that would cause mutation on the following segment. Particularly, morphemes that cause lenition will have a plus continuant feature. Those that cause eclipsis will have a plus nasal plus voice feature, and those that don't have any mutation will not have any features. I've taken an OT perspective to this analysis because I believe that OT provides the correct framework in order to describe the morphophonological alternations and capture the wide variety of realizations of the different mutations in Irish. So for lenition, I propose that there is a morpheme with a plus continuant feature, and when that precedes a consonant with a minus continuant feature, the plus continuant feature replaces the minus continuant feature. So for example, if you take the third person possessive pronoun, masculine, his, and you put it before the word cat, caught, you get the string a caught. But since there is the plus continuant morpheme denoting the genitive singular minus feminine, that will replace the minus continuant feature in caught, thus giving you the surface form a hot, his cat. Here is an OT table that gives this derivation. I have provided a deletion candidate, three different insertion candidates depending on where an inserted segment would be, how that fits with Irish syllable structure, and I have provided the winning candidate as well as a mutational candidate that applies retroactively instead of proactively, therefore in this case, violating linearity. As one can see, the winning candidate violates the constraints max and identity. Since I am working under the OT constraints that are traditionally used, like depth, max, onset, no coda, identity, linearity, and the morphophonological constraint, realized morpheme, there is a complex interaction amongst these different constraints. Additionally, I had to attend to Irish syllable structure, and that led me to propose two more constraints. One against coronal fricatives, namely that only S is the acceptable coronal fricative in Irish, and a prohibition on complex onsets that are two stop consonants. As you can see, the winning candidate in this example uh, only violates continuancy. From this, I was able to conclude that realized morpheme is a trigger for the mutation in Irish, namely that there is a necessity in Irish to realize morphosyntactic elements when possible, and that this realization is sensitive to syllable structure, but not faithfulness. That is, depth, no coda, and onset outrank realized morpheme, outrank max, outrank continuancy. Additionally, there are other relationships with linearity and complex onsets, as well as identity to palatalization and the prohibition of coronal fricatives, but I won't go into detail about that at the moment. Basically, what this tells us is that Irish requires morpheme realization, provided that the realization conforms to the language syllable structures. Furthermore, faithfulness constraints are not important, and for that reason, you can see changes in continuancy or place of articulation in order to realize these morphemes. Similarly, for eclipsis, I have proposed that there is a morpheme that has a plus nasal plus voice feature that when precedes a consonant that is minus voice, it will replace the minus voice feature with the plus voice feature. If it precedes a plus voice minus nasal consonant, it will replace the minus nasal with plus nasal. And if it precedes a vowel, there will be insertion of the segment N. All of the previous constraints that I used in lenition will also apply in my analysis of eclipsis. However, due to the insertion of N in particular cases, to rule out certain candidates, it was necessary to come up with the constraint that that a violation for every instance that N directly precedes another sonorant consonant in the onset of a syllable. Here, I provide two other examples of OT derivations. As you can see, again, the optimal candidate in table 14 only violates max and identity voice and none of the other constraints. And in table 15, we see that realized morpheme is violated so that um, the prohibition against N in another sonorant consonant won't be violated, therefore distinguishing between the second candidate and the fourth candidate in this table. What I could conclude from this was that there is an overall ranking of prohibition on N plus another sonorant consonant, no coda, linearity, and onset, which outrank DEP, which outrank realized morpheme, which outrank identity nasal, which outranks identity voice, and max. Furthermore, there's a secondary ranking of no complex stop consonantal onsets that outranks identity and max. This confirms the ranking that we found in Lenition, as well as proving that faithfulness to nasality must be higher ranked to voicing, otherwise we would expect voiceless consonants to also become nasals. Lastly, unlike Lenition, Eclipsis provides stronger evidence that syllable structure determines the fate of morpheme realization. In Lenition, DEP was similarly ranked with syllable constraints. However, in Eclipsis, syllable constraints outrank DEP, which further strengthens an argument about Irish syllable structure being the paramount constraints in Irish morphophonology. What does this mean? Primarily, my analysis provides an explanation for the morphosyntactic and morphophonological alternations seen in initial consonant mutations. But instead of analyzing these from morphosyntactic processes, these analyses maintain that they are phonological changes just like they were historically in Irish. Furthermore, the OT analysis of these mutations describes how these morphemes without phonological segments can change the features of the following consonant in a string. Furthermore, we see that the overall constraint ranking seems to be as follows. Syllable constraints are the highest ranked constraints, then followed by realization of the morpheme, which ultimately all outrank faithfulness. That is, realization of the morpheme is the trigger for change in Irish. That trigger allows for violations of faithfulness, provided that it complies with syllable structure. This has implications for the field of non-concatenative morphology more generally. It provides a framework for assessing morphosyntax and its relationship with phonology on the morphosyntax-phonology interface. It provides insight into the Irish lexicon as well, specifically that mutations are not stored in the lexicon, nor are they stored as processes associated with words, or are they simply just part of the phonology. Rather, they are morphemes themselves that have certain phonological content, but not segments, and it is up to phonology after spell out to manipulate these features resulting in mutation. Finally, this provides yet another example of how morphemes can be expressed phonologically even though they do not possess segments, much like grammatical tone. So in conclusion, this thesis has shown that initial consonant mutations in Irish are phonological processes triggered by unsegmented morphemes in the syntax needing to be realized phonologically. This is accomplished by attaching the phonological features of the morpheme to the adjacent segment. These mutations are sensitive to Irish syllable structure. The overall ranking is syllable structure outranks realization of the morpheme, which is the trigger, which outranks faithfulness. And this analysis provides a better framework describing initial consonant mutations as opposed to previous analyses because it captures much more of the data for where these mutations apply in modern Irish. I would like to thank Dr. Hyde and Dr. Barros as my thesis committee, as well as Dr. Danis and Dr. Van Egan, as well as all others who I have contacted and received material to help me with this thesis project. And finally, this is a slide of my references that were used in this presentation. All other references I will direct the listener to my thesis itself. Thank you.